Have you ever noticed gaps in your schedule? Little dead zones, perhaps only a few minutes long, that can't ever be properly accounted for? Or perhaps more accurately, periods of time where you always wind up in a certain place or away from another? Quite possibly not. I've only noticed one in my life, and it took years. See, I'm a university student in southwestern Ontario. It's more or less the southernmost point in Canada. So far south, in fact, that to get to America, we travel north. But that's neither here nor there. What is important, though, is that I have a class from 4 in the afternoon until 5:20. All the classes are staggered like that, 10 minutes off the half-hour mark, presumably to give students time to cross campus and get to their next classes. My 4 p.m. class isn't the most thrilling, if I'm honest, but it's in my major, so I deal with it. Besides, as a general rule, I'm a good student. Not the kind who spends every waking moment in the library obsessing over that 94% they got because they'll drop their average by 0.2%, of course, but I make it a rule not to skip lectures. This week, I made an exception. Now, that Sunday, I'd been hanging out with some friends of mine, perhaps a half dozen or so, all as a group. I'm an introvert by nature, and as much as I enjoy spending time with them, it usually makes the next day an emotional drudgery to do so. It was even worse this time. See, there's this girl there. I don't think I need to say anything more about that, frankly. Everybody in the world knows what it means when a 20-something-year-old guy says, "There's this girl." I could go on about her for hours, but nobody wants that. What's important is that I'm attached to her, shall we say. And she spent the evening fawning over the new guy in our group, Daniel. Really, I don't have any right to be upset. She and I have never been an item. So reasonably, I know you're all going to say I should just brush it off. Plenty of fish in the sea, and every other platitude people say. I know that almost every one of you has moped about a guy or girl in their lifetime, so sue me. The takeaway from all that is that I was miserable. Miserable for a juvenile reason, I accept, but miserable nonetheless. My car had been out of commission for the better part of a month too, so I had to get a ride from a friend, who got me on campus 10 minutes after my class started. That was really my screw it moment. I didn't want to go to class, and I definitely didn't want to walk all the way home. If I'd called my friend back, he would have picked me up again in a heartbeat, but he's also the sort who'd want to know why I was skipping class. That really wasn't a conversation I wanted to have at the time, so I decided to just walk around the campus for the hour or so remaining before I could get picked up without suspicion. The semester had just started a week or two ago, and the weather was nice, so there were still people milling about campus, just socializing. I walked around, trying my best to blend in as if anyone had interest in one particular student wandering the grounds. When the crowds began to thin out around 4:30, I was pleasantly surprised. I mentioned earlier that I'm an introvert, so being able to wander freely amidst the towering buildings and well-tended gardens while also being isolated from other people was a rare treat. This feeling didn't exactly diminish as more and more people headed inside. But there was a nagging feeling of wrongness about the situation. Eventually, the entire campus was deserted, which was unheard of to me. I'd been there at 2 in the morning and seen a handful of students drifting from place to place or sleeping on a bench outside. But for some reason, it was as though everybody on campus had subconsciously decided to head inside at 4:45 that afternoon. From the outside, the entire university might as well have been a ghost town. It was at this point I instinctively felt something was wrong. For the past 10 minutes or so, I'd felt a subtle urge to head inside, but by now, It felt absolutely imperative. I was heading into the chemistry building when I suddenly stopped. Having the entire campus to myself was a dream come true, and frankly, I kind of hoped the feeling of danger would turn out to be justified. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't suicidal, but at that point, I would have accepted any distraction from my experience that weekend. I closed the class door to the chem department without entering and turned around. Somehow, in the moment between my opening the door and my decision to remain outside, the world changed. It wasn't an obvious change, but it was there. Almost something you could feel in the air rather than see. The air felt hollow, for lack of a better word, empty. You know that feeling of rich air you get when you breathe in a truly fresh breath? There wasn't any of that. But neither was the acrid stench of pollution, or even the stale feeling of air that remained stagnant in a room too long. Aside from the physical feeling of air filling and emptying my lungs, I felt absolutely nothing when breathing. The second thing I noticed was the sun. It felt paler, and it was tinted green. Not a harsh green, not enough to colour the landscape, but enough that the warm glow was gone, replaced by something almost cadaverous. It felt harsher than usual too, though it provided no heat to my body. I wasn't sure what to make of these changes. I was certainly aware of them, but they were subtle enough to make me question whether it was all in my head. I left the chemistry building and began wondering once more. The term barren is the only way I can possibly describe the feeling. The entire property felt lifeless, not just in the sense that there were no people in sight, but the animals were gone, and even the plants didn't seem to be alive in any real way. The grass was still there, green as ever, but it looked dull and flat, rather than vibrant. The geese that usually cover the grounds were nowhere to be seen, and even the trees seemed to be little more than husks with waxen leaves. I continued to explore this desolate world, seeking objective evidence that things had changed, or that I was simply imagining all this. Within a minute or two of light exertion, I began to feel out of breath. I'm no star athlete, but usually I could go further than this without getting winded. This was the third thing that felt wrong, though it was quickly overshadowed by all that followed. There's a large tower in the very center of our campus, held up by grand concrete pillars spaced about a car lengths apart. It was there that I began to tire, and so it was there that I stopped to catch my breath. I leaned against one of the pillars, breathing heavily. I was only there for a moment, however, before there was a grating sound, and I found myself on the ground, with the section of pillar I had been leaned against crushed beneath me. Somehow, it had sheared off the pillar in a large, sharp chip. I stood up, confused, and pressed my hand to the pillar. For a moment, it felt solid, but then it gave way beneath the pressure, crumbling into a fine powder. It felt almost like burnt-out wood that had retained its shape, but crumbled to ash when touched. Even as my mind struggled to make sense of what had just happened, a sound arose from the area behind me. A sliding, skittering sound that made me think of insects and vermin, though somehow more sinister. I turned my head and saw a terrifying creature rounding the corner of the building and heading my way. It was big, at least as long as a small bear, and covered in black, reflective chitin. It was built roughly like a scorpion, though it didn't have the claws, rather two jointed appendages that ended in a sharp point. It was running along the wall of the building, its legs digging into the crumbling concrete and moving at an astonishing rate. I didn't stop to get a closer look. I screamed and ran, forgetting my fatigue. My entire body felt cold, hot, and numb at the same time as adrenaline began to pour into my system. I didn't have to turn around to know that thing was following me. I could hear its feet digging into the chalk-like ground, chipping it and tearing the concrete apart as it chased me. I sprinted towards the first building I saw, the biology building. I yanked on the handle. The metal door handle bent and twisted as I pulled, and it left flakes of rust on my hand. But the glass door opened. I dashed inside and slammed it behind me. I don't know why I thought the glass door would offer me even a moment's protection, but it seemed to work, because the creature didn't immediately follow me in. The lights were out in the building. Nothing else seemed to be out of place. There was no debris. The walls were intact, and the floor was clean. But I couldn't see any further than what was illuminated by the pale sunlight streaming through the glass door. I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew I didn't want to go back outside. So I turned on my phone's flashlight and headed further in. The biology building smelled. It always had. It smelled of frogs and chemicals, which always confused me because I'd assumed university students would be well past the days of dissecting frogs. Today was no exception. The further I went inside, the more it smelled of that peculiar mix of earth and fish. I didn't harbour much hope of finding anyone inside, even though I knew there were classes being held in there at this time. I just instinctively knew that they and I weren't in the same building. The unlit corridors proved that. The elevator didn't respond when I called it either. I wouldn't have gotten in even if it had, but I was curious. I'd been wandering the halls pretty much aimlessly, trying to think of a way out, when I heard the sound again. It was slower this time, more deliberate, as though it were trying to be as quiet as possible. I'd slowly made my way to the 4th floor, and the sound was coming from somewhere underneath my feet. So getting out of the building wasn't an option. I had to hide, and fast. I crept along the hallway as quietly as I could, without making noise, and headed into the first door I saw. My phone light was terribly inadequate for the purpose, and I had no idea which room I'd stumbled into. When I looked up and saw another person staring at me, I almost screamed, and so did he. It took me a moment to work out that I was in the bathroom, staring into a mirror. It was foggy and discoloured a pale yellow, but I could still see myself through it, and I didn't like what I saw. My reflection was pale, almost ashen, and visibly shaking. My eyes were bloodshot, and I swear I was thinner than when I woke up. Not skin and bones, but noticeably thinner. I took a step closer to inspect myself more thoroughly, when I heard the creature again. It was undeniably close. Right outside the door, I suspected. Then came the scratching, definitely on the bathroom door, and I could see it boring inwards with every scratch. I began to feel dizzy, and I leaned back against the sink, which promptly crumbled and left me sitting on the floor amidst a pile of ceramic rubble. The door continued to bow inward and started to splinter, and I could see the creature's legs poking through the gap between the frame and the door itself. I began to hyperventilate, and I raised my hand to the door in a futile effort to stave off the inevitable, when I was suddenly blinded by a bright light. I blinked, stunned, and saw that the power was back online. The door was back in its frame, and the sink was attached to the wall again. I could hear chairs sliding and students leaving their classes. Then I heard a girl scream from right beside me. Apparently, this particular washroom was the girls' washroom, and it had been occupied. I left the bathroom as quickly as I could, half running, half stumbling with my legs barely able to support me. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror as I ran out, and saw that I was still looking half dead and sick. When I burst out the door, I was relieved by the familiar, warm glow of the sun, now its rightful orange colour and properly comforting. I saw no trace of the creature, nor the damage I had left on the crumbling buildings. The next day, I saw my doctor and was immediately hospitalised due to my complexion, weight loss, and some pretty alarming results from my blood work. The doctor couldn't properly explain what had happened. He said that if he didn't know any better, he'd say I was a textbook case for radiation poisoning. But there was no potential cause, and I was recovering too quickly. Apparently, I'd simply suffered massive cell death across every system of my body for no clear reason. Fortunately, their treatment was simple. It basically boiled down to bed rest and good nutrition. I was home in a few days, though still not at full strength. I checked the university's course calendar. There are no courses that start at 5 p.m, nor are there any courses that end at 4:50 p.m. There aren't any exams at that time, or even extracurricular programs, and there weren't any last semester or the one before. There is absolutely nothing to give anyone reason to wander the campus any time around 5 p.m. It's as if the entire university has decided they want nothing to do with that particular time, and nobody finds that strange. I wouldn't either if I hadn't gone through all that. I didn't tell anyone what I saw that day. They'd think I'd gone insane. I was worried for a while that they might be right, but when I remembered my experience at the hospital, that was all the proof I needed. And when I'm in my class around 5, sometimes I'll look out the window. I see the sun shining the same way it always has. I see the trees swaying in the wind. I see lights in the other buildings and professors giving lectures, but I never see anyone outside.